Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you a closer look at the image quality from the Loxia 35mm f2 lens from Zeiss. So as we saw in our first look episode, this is a beautifully made and extremely compact option for a full-frame mirrorless Sony camera. And so it's certainly compelling on that front, and as we saw, the operation is beautiful on it. But today we want to take a closer look at the image quality itself. It's all well and good to have a very compact lens, but of course this is also a premium priced lens. And so does the actual performance of the lens justify the expense of it? Let's jump in and let's look at a number of metrics together and make that determination. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to do looking at the Loxia 35mm f2 is we're going to take a quick look at what happens when you correct the image in post. And so as you can see here, we have got files. These are raw files out of a Sony a7R Mark III. So, I mean, high resolution, 42 megapixels. And so as we take a look at this, we can see on the right side, uncorrected raw image. On the left, I've applied the two just check boxes here in Lightroom. And so one of those is the standard profile, the other is to remove chromatic aberration. And so as we can see, there is a mild vignette lift, not too heavy here as far as vignette goes, but there is certainly a more even illumination across the frame. As far as any kind of barrel distortion, it really is exceedingly mild. And so I think there is the slightest bit of bulge that's been corrected there, but not much to see. Now on the flip side, let's just cycle up a few stops and see how this clears up naturally. And so this is wide open f2. And now we'll toggle up to f2.8. You can see that there has been a vignette lift. However, it's not absolute. One more, you can see a bit, this is to f4, a little bit more of a lift, and now pretty even across frame. Let's go to f5.6. And you can see just the slightest bit more there that has been added. And now we're very even across the frame. And if I toggle on up to f8, I don't perceive any kind of ongoing lift. And so by f5.6, you have basically eliminated vignette as much as you're going to naturally by stopping down the lens. Now back to uncorrected images here. So these are just the raw files brought straight across. And so here I'm comparing f2 and f2.8. And so as we can see here, starting looking at the left side, the f2 image, we can see that in the center of the frame, resolution is actually pretty good. You can see there is a little bit of hazing that is reducing contrast. And we can see here as we look to the right that f2.8 is doing a lot to eliminate that and increasing the contrast in the center of the frame. Now, if we take a look off towards edge of the frame, we'll look at about 2/3 of the way there. You can see that the sharpness profile is about the middle half of the image. And as you come out towards the edge, both that reduced contrast and now also a little bit of softness at f2 is creeping in. You can see at f2.8 all of that is improved. And if we go down to the extreme corner, it's fairly soft down here. I mean, there still is resolution there, but the f2.8 version is of course better. It's only in the extreme corners that at f2.8 we're not seeing a great looking result. Now we'll take a look at the other side to see about our how well the copy is centered. Centering actually seems to be quite excellent. And so looking at more at the f2.8 version here, so we've got a strong result in this corner. And if we look in the opposite corner, we can see a similar type result. We'll look at upper right. We can see that it also looks roughly the same, and then lower left, and again, roughly the same. And so a fairly good result there when it comes to centering. Now comparing f2.8 to f4, center of the frame, we find that there really is not much difference between f2.8 and f4. So center sharpness seems to have already peaked pretty much by f4. What we're going to find, however, is that the edges definitely look much more even, and so our sharpness profile is about the same in the center, but it's pretty significantly different along the edges. And now we can see our sharpness really goes right into the extreme corners. We've got a really strong optical performance now, even looking at the corners of the frame. Now, we wouldn't expect to see much now of a difference in the center from f4 to f5.6, since we already saw how good it was even at f2.8, and we don't really see any kind of major difference. Looking towards the edge of the frame, I think what you're mostly seeing is there is a little bit more contrast there and a tick more resolution. I think a lot of what we see is a bit of vignette lift. And so really it looks like f5.6 is providing pretty optimal resolution across the frame. And by the way, this is exceptionally good resolution across the frame. Now going from f5.6 to f8, wouldn't expect to see much of a difference in the center, and I don't. Off at the edge of the frame, there may be just the slightest bit better resolution and contrast at the edge, and so I would say if you're wanting an optimal resolution for shooting landscapes, you can see a little bit of improvement here. f8 seems to be that optimal landscape aperture, at least on an A7R Mark III. Now, comparing f2 to f2.8 with a page of text, this is a lot of times where you can see, if you kind of angle the camera as I've done here, you can see some of the chromatic aberration. This is longitudinal chromatic aberration, and so typically some magenta fringing before the plane of focus, some green fringing after the plane of focus. We can see at f2 the reason for some of that haze and lack of contrast is due to a mild amount of chromatic aberration, more notably I would say a little bit of the green as opposed to the magenta or purple ahead of the frame. But what we can see is that certainly at f2.8 we're getting a lot more contrast, so much so that you can actually see some of the fiber of the paper, whereas here that's pretty much obscured by the haze that is there. And so going from f2 to f2.8 definitely provides an uptick in contrast. Now, if we take that out into the real world, we can see it play out. The first thing I do want to note is that even at f2, this is providing a credible image here. You can see a little bit of the haze that is there, but at the same time, our actual resolution, if you'll focus more on the left for a moment, it's not bad other than that haze. The resolution is there, but the contrast is down a little bit. But now if we look comparing f2 and f2.8 here in the center of the frame, we can see that definite uptick in contrast and how that haze is cleared up as we saw in our previous test. And what that allows is definitely more kind of impact on the image, more kind of bite, so to speak, to it, and just more crisp rendering of detail. This image is wide open at f2, and so it shows both some of the strengths and the weaknesses that we have seen here. One of those strengths is the fact that the color rendition really is magnificent. This is something that Zeiss does so very well, and it's definitely on display here. Another strength is that as we look at all of the textures that are rendered on this board, there really is a lot of detail there. As you get further away from the center of the frame, you can see some of that haze obscures some of that details, but even at f2 I think that this is a pretty credible image, and the global contrast of the image is quite good. We've seen that the micro contrast improves when that chromatic aberration lifts, but as you can see here, this is with basically no editing, that right out of the camera it provides an image with a pretty fair amount of pop here. Now in this set of images shot at f2 and then kind of towards the other extreme at f11, there's a few things that I want to highlight here. Number one, you can see a little bit of the purple fringing that is there here on a high contrast transition, and so that accounts for some of that hazing. Here you can see, of course, stop down, that has cleared up, and that is a non-issue. Looking also at the sunburst effect here, which of course you can't see a whole lot here, but it's more defined here. A little bit of a unique kind of maybe line doubling that you can see here, somewhat little less than the clearly defined blades. This is an even bladed 10 aperture blade lens, and so there you can see the kind of sun star that we can see. One final thing that I want to point out is you can see, kind of the impact that in a very harsh, transition, like the very bright light on these leaves, You can see that at wide open that a little bit of haze does impact, you know, how defined those lines are. There's kind of some bleed from the bright light there. Aberrations, and of course stop down, that's non-existent. Okay, so here I did a little bit of a torture test by, you know, trying to create as much lens flare as possible. As you can see, there definitely is some prismatic ghosting at the kind of the epicenter, and you can also see, if you position the lens just right, that you will get a fair artifact in there. Now, upside of this is that I was able to basically compose to eliminate most of that in most circumstances. And so what you have is what to me looks like a somewhat, you know, kind of analog retro type rendering that is there. I suspect that some people will find that attractive. Over here, a stop down to F11, what you can see is that that kind of prismatic ghosting pattern along this, you know, kind of the ray of the sun, axis of the sun ray, is a little bit more pronounced. I would say a little bit destructive in this case, stop down this far. And then this effect here, either, you know, you'll love or you'll hate that, but I wanted to demonstrate what was taking place there. Now you can see once again the impact between F2 and F2.8. I wanted to show an inside type scene, and so just under different kinds of lighting conditions, you can see how that contrast, it pops right up, going from F2 to F2.8. And you know, and you can see the difference in the bokeh rendering, which we'll start to transition to looking at the bokeh right now as a part of that. And so you can see a very, very mild amount of green fringing, but to be honest, it's the fringing is less of an issue. It's more the haze and lack of contrast that's there at F2 that I would say is more of an issue than anything. So looking at this image globally, you can see that the bokeh rendering from the lens, the Loxia 35mm, is actually, I would say, quite artful. Obviously, this isn't a huge maximum aperture nor a super long focal length, but it does a pretty interesting job of, an artistic job of doing the out of focus rendering. And I suspect that this is where, for many people, the strength of the lens will lie. It doesn't have maybe as much micro contrast, at least wide open, as some Zeiss lenses. It behaves a little bit more like some of the Zeiss classic lenses at wide aperture. But as you can see, the bokeh rendering is quite beautiful, even though here we're only talking about a maximum of 2 feet from the subject to the background. Now here in this kind of medium transition, what you can see is that there is some definite outlining to bokeh circles, and so in some ways, you know, again, there's a couple of ways to interpret this. Some may find that a little bit busy, others will probably find that very artful. I mean, the image as a whole, it definitely has a very unique kind of signature or look to it. I think I find it appealing, but anyway, that's certainly up to, you know, the beauty there is in the eye of the beholder. The image globally, though, you can tell beautiful color rendition, and I would say here you are seeing some of that Zeiss micro contrast in that there's definitely some three-dimensional pop to the subject. Now, if you move in a little bit closer, I wanted to shoot the same scene here to show how that at closer distances, when the background is more blown out, you get less of the edges. You know, a few here. You can see that circular shapes stay very circular right out towards the edge of the frame. That's a plus. And so depending on how far you are from the subject, here, I mean, you mostly are getting quite a creamy, nicely defocused background. I'll toggle back for a second. And here you're getting a little bit more of a, you know, it almost like there's a dynamic quality to the image, almost like some movement there. So you'll either love that or hate that. I'll leave it up to you. Here's another where I've gotten quite close to the subject, and so the background is more diffused. And what you can see is that, I mean, the background blurs away very nicely. Color looks great, and really there's nice detail here on some of these, you know, like the fine here. Not a lot of chromatic aberration in that, and so, it's more the haze that may or may not be an issue for you. Beautifully rich color. I mean, if you choose a subject that has great color, you know, naturally, Zeiss does a wonderful job of recreating that color. That's part of what would make this quite an appealing lens for doing, say, video work. And so here it's done a beautiful job. Now this is actually shot in APS-C mode. on my A7R Mark III, and so it might give you an idea of what you can expect where you have a, closer to 50mm focal length with the crop factor applied, 52.5 millimeters, and so that gives you an idea. It's still a very, very appealing focal length, and I think an appealing image. And so as you can see, the response to the question that we posed at the beginning is somewhat nuanced. Whether or not this lens justifies its price is really going to depend on your priorities. And so if you are looking for a lens that is sharp from corner to corner with very high contrast at f2, the answer is probably not. The main sharpness profile covers a little over 1/2 of the image circle, edging out maybe towards 2/3. But really the extreme corners don't get very sharp until somewhere between f2.8 and f4. And optimal aperture for shooting landscapes is somewhere around f8. At the same time, however, we saw that the lens certainly has sufficient sharpness for most situations, even if there is a little bit of haze at wide open apertures. By f2.8, that haze kind of clears up, and so you're left with a very high contrast, sharp image. But I think more than anything, those that are looking at this lens are going to maybe be looking at it for some of the same values that a lot of people looked at in the classic Zeiss lenses. And that includes things like color rendition, which is gorgeous here, the bokeh quality, which is very, very pleasing, if somewhat artistic and unique, subjective maybe. And you've looked at images with me, you can make that determination for yourself. The other thing, though, I think that a lot of people will look at this lens for is things like the Zeiss, three-dimensional pop, micro contrast, and those things are certainly on display. And so if you want a artful lens that is extremely compact, I think that the Loxia 35mm f2 is going to be an interesting lens. And I think more to the point is for those that do video. And in my final review, when I come back to you, I will show you some video footage and include that in my final determination. And so stay tuned for that. Also, of course, in the meantime, you can continue to look in the description down below. There's linkage there to the image gallery, and so you can look at the photos I'm taking as a part of this review process. And of course, there are buying links there, and you can follow me on social media. You can become a patron. And if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.